Chapter 14 Phantoms of the Past, Part 1. Gilda glided alongside Applejack as she raced back to her aunt and uncle's apartment. As she galloped, she could have sworn she heard the roll of thunder not once, but twice. Still, there were no clouds in the night sky, leaving her with little doubt as to the source. It was the same thunder from Baltimore. 5 moons ago, it held a mystifying air to it, and when she first found Solaire in Twilight, it gave her an inspiring sense of awe. Now she only felt dread as the thunder echoed in her ears. With that horrid dragon tramping about, and the angered roar she heard later. By heavens, were they actually fighting it? Applejack pushed herself further, urgency biting away at her consciousness. Gilda sensed it too. Though she had told Gertrude and Galahad to take them through the sewers, the salesmare sowed seeds of doubt in her mind with each frantic glance at the horizon. She knew something Gilda didn't, and her panic only stressed the griffin more. They rounded the last corner, finding themselves back at the apartments where they had met. Gilda touched down onto the street, raking her talons across the cobblestone as she came to a sliding halt. Applejack galloped into the alleyway, and Gilda barked out an order she knew the pony didn't need.
"Hurry up and get the wagon ready. We're taking it with us."
As Applejack disappeared into the shadows, Gilda took her post, watching both ends of the street, even checking the sky. She found herself panting, for reasons more than just exhaustion. The Warriors of Sunlight were in trouble. She needed to get to them now, bail them out of whatever fight they had gotten themselves into. They were the best chance the Griffins had at defeating Nightmare Moon. She knew it in her gut. It was the same feeling she had had with Eve, though she wouldn't admit it in front of them, but she had lost her chance with her. She would not let them slip through her talons too. Behind her, the door to the apartments was thrown open, and Gilda heard armored hooves exit.
"Hey, go easy, Jester. We don't need you hitting your head again."
Gilda whirled around, but even as she did, she could feel her heart spike. Why did that voice sound so familiar? 2 guards stood in the doorway, both staring at her in surprise. One was the same guard she had knocked out before, just outside Applejack's apartment. The other wore the same black armor as the nights before, but she was not a Thestral. The blue feathered wings on her sides proved it. The knight's helmet obscured most of her face, though Gilda caught a glimpse of magenta eyes staring widely back at her. Out from the alley, Applejack burst into the street, towing her wagon behind.
"I have everything they need, Gilda. Let us make haste." "Gilda?"
the Black Knight echoed. "Applejack!" Jester exclaimed in an accusing tone. His eyes slid across the street to Gilda and narrowed at her. "I guess that makes you the griffin I have to thank for this ringing headache." He took a step down from the entryway to the apartments, and the knight held a hoof out to stop him.
"Hey, I said take it easy."
She barked, but there was a slight tremor in her voice. Her eyes couldn't leave the griffin even as she spoke. "That mare is suspected of helping the griffin insurgents and the traitors to the throne," he argued. "I don't know what your orders are, knight, but she can't be allowed to leave." Gilda tore her eyes away from the mysterious knight and barked out to the salesmare.
"Applejack, get to the others, now! You know your way through this city. I'll make sure they don't follow you." "But, Gilda..." "Go! And don't stop for anything!"
With a pained expression, Applejack reared back and broke into a gallop down the streets. Jester was the first to react, flaring out his wings and taking to the air after her. But he was slow. It didn't take long for Gilda to catch up to him. She glided alongside him, tucked her legs in tightly before tilting her body and shoving against him with all her might. He careened over to the side, crashing into the building next to him and stumbling to a heap along the sidewalk, no more conscious than the last time Gilda had left him. Before Gilda had the chance to admire her work, something crashed into her side. Hard. A mass of black metal and blue wings. They tumbled through the air, striking the cobblestone and cartwheeling over one another until the knight finally landed on top. Her forelegs stamped down on Gilda's shoulders roughly, but the griffin knew the knight could have done far worse. The knight's voice cracked as she pinned Gilda to the street.
What are you doing?
Something churned in Gilda's stomach. That voice, those eyes, her speed. It couldn't have been. But she had to make sure. Faster than the knight could react, Gilda reached out with her talons to the base of the knight's helmet, and with a forceful shove, it went flying off into the night. The helmet clattered against the street, ringing like a distant bell. Gilda could barely hear it as she stared at the face of the mare above her. Out in the moonlight, she could clearly see every detail. Her mane had 6 colors, distinctive even among ponies. Gilda recalled when first they had met that the mare had to convince her that the rainbow colors were natural. It was uniformly cut, but all that time spent under the helmet had made it as unkempt as Gilda remembered it. Her coat was as blue as the sky from a distant memory, back when the sun blazed brightly over Cloudsdale. But under the moonlight, it looked pale. The mare's magenta eyes stared widely at her, as though she was seeing a ghost. As far as Gilda was concerned, though, it was the Pegasus that had returned from the dead. Through her numbed senses, Gilda could barely feel an emotion rattling and swelling in her core. Her face twitched.
You.
Rainbow Dash blinked. Gilda's voice echoed endlessly in her mind. She could feel her legs shaking. She tore her eyes off of the griffin beneath her and spotted the runaway mare. Without another thought, her wings snapped open and she launched herself forward. The wind whipped against her ears, drowning out the echoes still buzzing within. But no matter how fast she flew, she still couldn't outrun the flood of memories chasing after her. As she passed the trailers, she banked sharply into the ground, flaring out her wings. The Earth Pony was scrambling to lose her momentum.
Halt! By order of the throne!
She barely had time to register the brown and white blur that shot out from beyond the trailer, until it collided into her side. Rainbow Dash and Gilda rolled into the sidewalk, giving Applejack ample room to pass. This time, Gilda landed on top. Her talons dug beneath the edges of Rainbow's cuirass, and she lifted the Pegasus by her chest to meet her scowling beak.
You!
Rainbow Dash wedged her hooves between Gilda's claws and pried herself free. With a beat of her wings, she took back to the sky and twisted herself back to the runaway mare, her only salvation from this horrible encounter. But before she could get any headway, something snatched her tail. With a surprised yelp, she turned back to find Gilda in the air, her claw gripping her tail tight.
Let go of me!
She shouted, kicking at the claw with an armored hoof. She managed to slip free, but she knew it was only because Gilda let her. The griffin rose to her height, hovering dangerously close. Rainbow Dash hesitated.
I can outfly you, Gilda,
she warned. The griffin snorted.
You always were the fastest back in flight camp, but I was always stronger. So long as you have to stop, I can beat you in a fight.
Rainbow Dash fluttered back, shaking her head.
We don't have to fight. We're friends, Gilda. Are we?
Gilda challenged. She gave the mare another once-over, still unconvinced of what she was seeing.
I just ran into 5 Thestrals wearing that same armor, Dash. Are they your friends too? Gilda, it's complicated.
Rainbow needed an escape. She hadn't spoken to Gilda in years, not since the Civil War started. This wasn't the time or the place to catch up. They had been best of friends since flight camp. And if Gilda knew what she had become now... The runaway mare was shrinking on the horizon behind her. It was her only way out of this confrontation. She twisted around, but Gilda was quick to cut her off, hovering between Dash and her target. The griffin folded her claws across her chest, and her eyes narrowed into a scrutinizing glare.
Make it uncomplicated,
she demanded. Rainbow Dash shook her head again. Maybe if she did it enough, she would wake up from this nightmare.
Don't make me do this, Gilda. I need to catch that mare. Sorry, Dash, but she's on my side. And I thought you were too.
Rainbow Dash tried to protest, but Gilda cut her off.
When my parents dumped me in Cloudsdale for that stupid flight camp all those years ago, I thought I was going to be miserable, being the only griffin there. But you were the first one to give me a chance. You showed me that you ponies weren't all that bad. You were my best friend, Dash, my only friend.
Rainbow Dash felt something in her chest deflate.
Please. And when you wrote to me that you were joining Equestria's Royal Guard, I'd never been more proud of you,
she continued, jabbing a talon into her chest.
I got to brag to all of Griffinstone that I was friends with the coolest pony in Equestria. And then Nightmare Moon came back and took over everything. And I didn't hear from you for years.
She grit her teeth, trying desperately to bite back a flood of emotions. This should have been a happy moment, seeing her friend alive after all this time. But that black armor around her sucked all the joy she deserved out of it.
I thought you were dead,
she growled.
Because the Rainbow Dash I knew would never have let Nightmare Moon win, let alone fight for her. But I guess you always were full of surprises. Gilda, that's not fair,
Rainbow Dash choked.
We lost the war. There wasn't anything else I could do.
A few 10 seconds passed as they hovered in the air. Finally, Gilda spoke.
But there is now.
She extended an open claw to the mare, but her eyes burned with a challenge.
Come with us,
she said sternly.
Ditch the armor, forget your orders, and help us fight Nightmare.
Rainbow Dash stared at her waiting claw. Her mind felt like it was tearing itself apart. This was it. This was her window, the opportunity she wanted.
I want to,
she said, barely breaking a whisper.
I really do, but...
Shining Armor's words echoed in her head, and she looked up to her old friend. Gilda's eyes furrowed at the mare, and her talon slowly closed.
It's not worth it, Gilda. You can't beat her, trust me.
Rainbow tried desperately to explain.
And the more we fight, the more every pony is going to suffer for it, ponies and griffins. I know it doesn't sound great, but the best we can do right now is wait for the real princess to come back. And how long is that supposed to take?
Gilda demanded. Rainbow Dash didn't answer immediately, and from her hesitation, the griffin knew all she needed.
Too long,
she spat.
Just what I thought. Sorry, Dash, but I'm not going to wait around for somebody else to fix my problems.
The knight shook her head.
Gilda, you're not listening to me. If you keep this up, you're going to lose, just like I did. Then I'll lose. the Griffin shouted back. But unlike you, I'm not going to change sides when I do. I'll stay loyal to our cause till the end.
Her words struck like a mallet against a bell, and Rainbow's body felt hollow as a powerful guilt rang within her.
Don't do this, Gilda. Please,
she begged.
Don't make me the bad guy.
The Griffin shot her a venomous glare.
You did that yourself when you put on that armor.
A heavy silence fell over the pair, broken only by the beats of their wings. The runaway mare was long gone. The only question that remained was what would happen next. Rainbow Dash found that she couldn't look her old friend in the eyes.
I need to report to my lieutenant,
she finally said. But as she floated back, Gilda reached out and grabbed her foreleg in a vice.
I don't think you heard me,
Gilda growled.
We're not on the same side, Dash. Gilda, let me go,
Rainbow grunted. She tried to pull her hoof away, but the Griffin's talons wouldn't budge. She placed her other hoof over the claw and tugged harder.
Gilda! Why? So you can return to your princess and follow your orders?
Gilda challenged.
I don't want to fight you!
Gilda's facade threatened to break as Rainbow screamed at her. She saw tears streaming down the mare's cheeks, tracing across her chin, and splashing against her armor. That black, infernal armor. The armor of the enemy she swore to defeat. The enemy that had stolen all of her friends. Even her best friend. Her grip around Rainbow tightened even more.
Good,
she spat, barely controlling the tremor in her voice.
It'll be over quick then.
Before her old friend could say any more, Gilda allowed her wings to tuck in. Rainbow Dash couldn't support the dead weight, and the two spiraled down to the street below. Shining Armor was still in a daze, relying on instinct alone to keep his head on his shoulders. Down the street, the warrior continued to sling her spells. His sister continued to sling her spells.
Why did it have to be her?
He threw himself to the ground as another unstable hex arced wildly towards him. The fur on his neck stood on end as the spell singed the air where he had once been. Even as he dodged, he found that he couldn't tear his focus away from the fire burning in his sister's eyes. Those once so innocent, purple eyes. What had happened to her? What had he done? Armor snapped out of his trance in time to see the next attack. A trio of purple bolts rushing towards him from down the street, orbiting themselves in a helix and racing to see which would strike him first. Even in this unstable form, he was certain he knew what that spell was. A normal shield wouldn't save him. He needed to think bigger. Manhattan took on a purple hue as he conjured a protective dome around himself. The magical bolts tore away from each other, spreading wide before crashing into his barrier. Armor winced and let the dome fall. He needed to concentrate on what his sister was plotting next. Twilight was in the middle of charging another spell. Even in the moonlight, Armor could see the sweat gathering over her furrowed brow. She couldn't keep up this sort of tempo, but the unyielding fire in her eyes said that she wouldn't let that stop her. She had left herself wide open for a shot. She hadn't even realized it. But then again, how could she? Armor had never taught her how an actual duel worked. He had hoped the night would never come. He had the thought to try and call out to her again, to try and talk her out of fighting. But his attention drifted towards the spell she was trying so hard to cast. It was big. Too big. Big enough to nearly consume her, and still it was growing. Purple lightning crackled within an orb whose surface danced as sporadically as the chaos within. Still, Twilight strained to control it and refused to release it. Had she ever attempted a spell like this before? Armor felt as though he already knew the answer. Fear had his heart in a vice. The spell over his sister shuddered. She had to let it go. Twilight! Stop! Twilight's spell collapsed upon itself in time to punctuate his call. There was a blinding light, followed quickly by a thunderclap. It took Armor more than a few rubs and blinks to allow his eyes to readjust. And when his vision returned to normal, his heart sank. Twilight was laying in a heap. He shouted out to her, numbly aware that he was already running. Twilight! Before the stallion could reach her, though, a flurry of wings and talons intercepted him. Gertrude knew she was out of her league when the duel began. After all, what more could one griffin do between a battle of mages that stand helplessly on the sidelines and watch? But something had happened to Twilight, and this stranger was rushing up to her while she was down. Not a stranger, Twilight's brother, she reminded herself, as she dove after him. She tucked her body in as she reached the knight and pushed for all she was worth. He was sent sprawling across the street, rolling to a stop against the sidewalk with a pained grunt. Gertrude loomed over Twilight, unsure of how to check if she was all right. Mindful of her talons, she rolled the mare onto her back. Twilight's head lolled to one side, a pained groan the only sign that she was awake.
Twilight, hey!
Gertrude cooed anxiously. She grabbed the mare's chin in her talons and gave her a gentle, urgent shake.
Come on now,
she continued, her tone bordering on sing-songy.
We really can't stay here.
As though to agree, the dragon called a victorious roar. It woke Shining Armor from his daze, and a new urgency washed over him with a chill. How could he have forgotten the dragon? As he laid in the street, gathering his senses, he couldn't help but remember Nightingale's brief. The dragon was looking for two things and two things alone. A giant, the likes of which no pony has ever seen before, and a young, purple unicorn. His eyes flicked back to his sister, a perfect description of the wanted mare, still unconscious with a griffin standing over her. He had to get her out of here. His gaze focused on the griffin. Digging deep within, he hurled a magical bolt from his horn. The griffin squawked as she was launched to the other side of the street, and Shining Armor didn't waste his chance. He galloped to his sister, stumbling to a stop just over her, and cupped her head in his hoof. He called softly, and Twilight's eyes began to flutter open. Armor found himself smiling, a hopeful smile he hadn't had in years, until recognition sparked in his sister's eyes, and she swung at him with a hoof. It connected to the side of his face. It wasn't strong enough to hurt, but the blow still left him stunned. With wide eyes, he stared into his sister's. Though the punch had been weak, the true damage was made up for by the intent in her defiant glare. Shining Armor opened his mouth to speak, but he couldn't find the words.
I don't need you to protect me anymore,
Twilight said bitterly. Her voice barely broke a whisper.
I'm not the little sister you abandoned.
No. You're not. Though his heart was shattered, Armor could feel his lips twitching into what might have been the ghost of a smile. But this wasn't the right time to reminisce, and it certainly wasn't the right place. You've come a long way since I last saw you, he admitted softly. His lips pressed into his stern line, and he shook his head. But you weren't supposed to follow in my footsteps. You weren't supposed to start another rebellion.
You don't get it, do you?
Twilight scoffed.
This isn't about you, or any of the awful things you've done. This isn't even about me.
The words were sticking in her throat. Though the light from the mirror and the moon washed over them from above, Twilight prayed her brother couldn't see the tears welling in her eyes.
I didn't even want this,
Twilight admitted with a tremor in her voice.
All I was looking for was a spell, not a quest. I'm terrified of where it could take me, of who it's taking me to.
Then stop, Armor pleaded. I've seen the end of this road, Twilight. You're not going to like it. He hesitated as his chest clenched. He tried not to imagine his sister before Nightmare. I'm not going to like it either, he confessed. Twilight, you're all the family I have left. His sister didn't respond at first. She stared up at him with tear-stained eyes, looking over as though for the first time. He found himself hopeful that maybe he had finally spoken some sense into her. Maybe there was a way to salvage this night. But as he had learned over the last 5 years, hope was a wicked knife. It had invaded his heart, and as his sister's gaze hardened, it twisted inside before tearing itself out.
You should have acted like it then,
she said. With a hoof, Twilight managed to push her brother off of her. It didn't require much force. Though she never managed to hit him with a spell, he appeared too wounded to resist.
Maybe you're right,
she admitted as she clambered up to her hooves. She tried to make herself look big, but with Armor so close, it was clear that he was still the tallest.
Maybe I won't like how this ends, but you might be wrong too.
Armor shook his head, opening his mouth to speak, but Twilight cut him off.
I believe in Solaire,
she said firmly.
He taught me to believe in myself. And I know I don't have to see this quest to the end by myself. He'll be with me every step of the way, and so will Applejack, and Gilda, Uncle Tails, and Gertrude and Galahad.
Something swelled in her chest, a pride that grew with every friend she had made, a pride she knew she would continue to grow with each new one she hadn't met yet.
And together, I know there's nothing we can't accomplish.
A pang of guilt echoed in Shining Armor's quickly hollowing chest. Twilight didn't know about Tall Tale's fate. Even though he had personally left before the verdict, word had spread quickly across Everfree Castle, confirming his concerns. Twilight. How could he tell her? He tried to gather his nerves, but he quickly realized that Twilight was no longer staring at him, but something behind him. Before he could see for himself, he heard it. A low, heavy growl rattled the air. Armor tore his eyes away from his sister and found the dragon fully rounding a corner far, far down the street. His guts wrenched, knowing that the distance meant nothing to it. It had lost its helmet, somehow, and its greedy eyes never looked more wild as they bored past him. With an excited bark, it began hobbling towards them. It was then that Armor realized it carried something in its claw, something that glistened in the moonlight. Before he could make sense of it, though, a powerful force struck the back of his head. Twilight watched as her brother crumpled from the blast of her spell, but her eyes couldn't be torn away for long from what the dragon had in its clutch. Chainmail draped over broad shoulders seemed to sparkle like a beacon in the moonlight. A pale, furless head with a disheveled mane of gold bobbed with each step the dragon took. Twilight found herself running, not fully aware of what she was running to. She cried out to the dragon's prisoner, hoping that through some miracle, it would save him.
Slayer!